When a war shows up on your phone, how much of it are you supposed to watch? Opening a phone to find a concert review now frequently means stumbling into footage of a war zone. In an essay published on 23 July 2026, a trauma researcher looks at what this uninvited exposure to graphic violence does to the nervous system. The piece moves past the guilt of wanting to look away, offering a different approach to the news. It asks how someone can stay informed without letting a bottomless feed of tragedy break their capacity to actually help them. Written by Naina Mochnik in Psych, narrated for Ava. When the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina erupted in the 1990s, newspapers, broadcasters and publishers decided what was documented and shared with the world. Looking back now at the materials available from that period, it's one of the conflicts I study in my research on sexualized violence. I know that most accounts passed through expert hands before reaching a broader audience. Researchers, editors, and journalists played the role of institutional gatekeepers, shaping not only what was revealed about the violence, but how, to whom, and when. Those filters were sometimes politically motivated and frequently inadequate, but they put limits on how information was presented and the pace at which it spread, and that pace allowed it to be processed, accumulated, and eventually acted upon. Recent bloodshed in the Middle East, Ukraine, and beyond, along with the ubiquity of smartphones and the rise of citizen journalism, where ordinary people report directly to the public, have profoundly disrupted that traditional pattern and put the public in closer contact with graphic content. Before, even when the material was heavy, there were edges to it. When you closed your computer and left your desk, you could return to life beyond it. Now I find myself, like many others, reaching for my phone absent-mindedly on the metro on my way home, opening Instagram to look for something trivial, such as a concert recommendation, a theatre review, or one of the squirrel videos my husband and I like to send each other. Instead, I'm confronted by the evidence of an ongoing massacre, or footage of tortured prisoners. Human brutality shows up uninvited between two metro stops, with little context or warning, embedded in the same stream as entertainment, advertising, and everyday chatter. This kind of proximity is difficult to handle, even for someone like me, who has spent her professional life working with trauma narratives and accounts of violence. Over time, I have learned how damaging second-hand exposure to these things can be to emotional and physical well-being. The clinical literature on secondary and vicarious trauma broadly agrees on a recognizable cluster of symptoms, which range from disturbed sleep, fatigue and headaches, to fear and cynicism, to strained relationships. However, one's responses can be deeply personal and, at times, unsettlingly atypical. In my own experience with secondary trauma, I recognized signs that others had described: hopelessness, persistent fatigue, my hormonal system crashing. But it also emerged in a strange mix of dark, unpalatable humour, at times slipping into sudden, uncontrollable laughter, almost never funny to anyone but me. What was perhaps most disturbing was how little control I seemed to have over it. Today, the raw and horrific images that make it out into the wider world reach not only those of us with a professional focus on trauma, but also those who have never learned how to protect themselves. Although it is often possible to mute, unfollow, or filter what one sees on social media, even a carefully curated feed cannot be fully controlled. Difficult material finds its way in through what others repost, what is recommended, what slips into view. What's more, many people feel that they should not look away, that it would be a kind of moral failure. The pull to keep up, to register every event as it breaks, and to signal that one cares, can make watching feel obligatory. Without some form of selection, contextualization, and distance, what people witness is carried inward and eventually threatens well-being. While in my case this followed prolonged exposure and engagement with traumatic testimonies of violence, I fear that even passive viewing can carry a cost. Importantly, witnessing tragic events is not just about seeing. It is a process of encountering information, reckoning with it cognitively and emotionally, and then deciding how to respond. As the philosopher Kelly Oliver argues in Witnessing, 2001, response is fundamental to witnessing, whether it ultimately involves speaking, writing, donating, organising, or simply carrying what one has seen in a way that influences how one moves through the world. To be able to do this, those who witness must be able to acquire the necessary information without becoming overwhelmed, and then have the time and space to make sense of it. Social media short-circuits this process. The volume and immediacy of content make it difficult to fully absorb any single event before the next one arrives. The psychologist Paul Slovic has highlighted that humans are simply not well equipped to care about large numbers of people simultaneously, not because we are naturally indifferent, but because we lack meaningful ways to comprehend suffering at that scale, let alone to directly intervene. As Slovic put it, the more who die, the less we care. His point predates the current social media era, but the constant parallel streams of crises make that response even harder to avoid. The sense of futility compounds with every new tragedy that appears. Social media has become one of the primary spaces where conflicts are framed and experienced. In On Photography, 1977, and later in Regarding the Pain of Others, 2003, Susan Sontag similarly explored the idea that repeated exposure to images of suffering leads to desensitization. Pain can become familiar, then distant, and instead of provoking action, it might actually weaken our moral response. What Sontag observed in a comparatively slower media environment has become a defining condition of digital life. And when crises accumulate faster than they can be processed, stepping back may be a necessary form of self-protection. The easiest option would be to withdraw from social media entirely. One could rely solely on edited news, where information is still filtered, contextualized, and paced by professional judgment. But in my line of work, and for many of us, social media is an essential resource, one that we must use to some extent in order to engage credibly with contemporary developments and crises. Social media has become one of the primary spaces where conflicts are framed and experienced. If one cannot simply avoid the stream, then the question is how to witness differently, more sustainably, neither attempting to witness everything in an effort to feel morally adequate, nor shutting it out completely when it starts to feel like too much. Sustainable witnessing means recognizing what can be meaningfully held, understood, and acted upon within our actual cognitive and emotional limits, and allowing the rest to pass without guilt. It is about choosing depth over breadth and intention over pressure. We can make an analogy to food consumption. In societies with abundant access to calorie-dense foods, people cannot consume limitlessly without it becoming harmful. Or can we practice consuming emotionally challenging content online without getting sick? As with food consumption, the problem may not be so much the abundance of information, but the absence of an adequate framework for managing our intake. Instead, much of online engagement is driven by the pressure to consume as much as possible in order to keep up, to react, to show that we care. But reactions produced under such pressure are frequently shallow and unfocused. They might relieve the uncomfort of inaction, but they do not necessarily lead to greater understanding or meaningful engagement. If witnessing, as Oliver suggests, is defined by what follows from what we see, then posting and sharing can certainly be part of that process, but they ought to lead to some other forms of activity, such as deeper learning, supporting those who provide relief to victims, or joining collective efforts for change. Concrete actions can provide a more durable sense of contribution than online reaction alone ever could. The pressure to react is part of what exhausted me, as well as many others who work closely with traumatic material, before we learned how to engage with this material in more sustainable ways. As more of us seek to develop sustainable witnessing practices, we can borrow from the strategies of scholars, journalists and other professionals who have long worked with difficult material. This may include things like deciding to follow one conflict closely instead of tracking them all, choosing a small number of trusted sources to follow rather than endless feeds, and setting clear temporal boundaries, times to engage and times to disconnect, without interpreting time away as some kind of moral failure. Sometimes sustainable witnessing might mean resisting the urge to look at or repost graphic material when you're already feeling emotionally stretched. This kind of managed and filtered engagement could help create the conditions for deeper and more meaningful involvement. When attention isn't fragmented across countless crises, it is more possible to move from reaction to understanding, and from understanding to sustained forms of response. This may begin with a question: what can I meaningfully contribute, and where might my efforts take a tangible form? For some of us, working in fields like education or in civil society, the answer lies within our everyday work. For others, it might take the form of volunteering on days off, supporting a specific political initiative that aligns with one's values, or showing up where needed in other ways. Concrete actions that will likely provide a more durable sense of contribution than online reaction alone ever could. As the editorial filters and institutional boundaries that once shaped how we witnessed horrific events have largely disappeared, personal habits of selection and management are becoming increasingly important. Our nervous systems and emotional capacities have not evolved at the pace of digital technologies. This means that we need to become our own editors, regaining control over our circle of concern, reflecting on what we can realistically hold. In doing so, each of us can help build new norms within our communities and digital cultures around how much exposure is enough, when to pause and recover, and what effective witnessing really entails.